Welcome. Imagine standing at the edge of two worlds, 1 foot in Europe, one in Asia, on a narrow strip of water where empires have fought, prayed, traded, and died for 10,000 years. This is not a metaphor. This is a real place. And the civilization that grew from it is one of the most layered, powerful, and enduring stories in all of human history. Before a single Ottoman soldier raised a sword, before the great domes of Istanbul pierced the sky, before Mustafa Kemal stood before a new nation and declared that everything must change, this land was already ancient beyond measure. Çatalhöyük was a living city when most of the world had not yet imagined what a city could be. Hittite kings signed the world's first recorded peace treaty on this soil. Greek philosophers walked its coastal roads. Roman legions built their roads across its plateaus. Byzantine emperors prayed beneath the golden mosaics of Constantinople for 1,000 years. And then, from the vast Central Asian steppes, riders came, and nothing was ever the same again. This is the complete story of Turkey. Not a fragment, not a single dynasty or a single century. The full arc. From the Neolithic mud brick rooms of Çatalhöyük, around 7,500 years before Christ, through the Turkic migrations that reshaped the medieval world, through the rise of a small frontier principality near Söğüt around 1299, that would become one of history's greatest empires, through the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, through the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, through the long unraveling of Ottoman power, through the catastrophe of the First World War and the Armenian Genocide, through the War of Independence and the radical birth of a secular republic in 1923, all the way to the tensions, crises, and unresolved questions of the 21st century. We will walk through the caravanserais of the Seljuk Plateau and the gilded courtyards of Topkapi Palace. We will stand at the walls of Constantinople on the morning of May the 29th, 1453. We will sit in the modest assembly hall in Ankara, where a new nation was declared from the ruins of empire. We will ask why this land has never stopped mattering to its own people, to its neighbors, and to the world. Because Turkey is not simply a country with a history. It is a crossroads that has never stopped being contested. The tensions between East and West, between secular and sacred, between empire and republic, between memory and reinvention, they did not end in 1923. They are alive today, in every debate about identity, in every minaret rising beside a modern skyline, in every question about where this nation of 85 million people truly belongs in the world. If you love complete journeys through the rise and fall of civilizations, through the lives of rulers and ordinary people alike, through the turning points that shaped the modern world, please subscribe so you do not miss a single part of this exploration. Each week we bring you the full story of a world that made history. The gates of this extraordinary journey are open. Let us step into that history now. The land exists before the story begins. It rises from the sea in great plateaus of pale limestone and volcanic stone, cut by river valleys that catch the morning light and hold it long after the surrounding hills have fallen into shadow. To the west, the Aegean coast breaks into 1,000 inlets and peninsulas. To the east, the land climbs toward mountains that hold snow through the summer months. To the south, the Taurus Range forms a wall between the interior and the warm Mediterranean shore. This is Anatolia, the land of the rising sun, as the Greeks would one day call it, and it has been inhabited, contested, built upon, and mourned over for longer than most of the world's civilizations have existed, somewhere around 7,500 years before the Common Era, on a flat plain in what is now south-central Turkey. A community of several thousand people built a settlement unlike anything yet seen in the ancient world. Çatalhöyük rises from the earth as a dense honeycomb of mud brick rooms, each one pressed against the next, with no streets between them. Entry comes through holes in the rooftops. The walls inside are painted with geometric patterns, with hunting scenes, with the outlines of human hands. The dead are buried beneath the floors of the living. This is not a primitive camp. It is a complex, organized community with shared ritual life, specialized labor, and a sense of permanence that speaks to something deeply intentional in the human spirit. Çatalhöyük endures for over 1,000 years before its people disperse into the wider world, leaving behind a mound of compressed memory that archaeologists will not begin to understand until the 20th century of the Common Era. The centuries pass. New peoples move across the Anatolian plateau. Around 1,600 years before the Common Era, a civilization emerges from the Central Highlands that will leave its name carved into the rock of history. The Hittites build their capital at Hattusa, a city of massive stone walls and great carved gates where lions and sphinxes stand guard in the mountain air. The Hittite Empire reaches from the Aegean coast to the upper Euphrates, and at the Battle of Kadesh around 1,274 years before the Common Era, Hittite chariots clash with the armies of Pharaoh Rameses II in one of the earliest recorded military engagements in human history. The peace treaty that follows is the oldest surviving international agreement. Yet by 1,180 years before the Common Era, the Hittite state collapses in the wider catastrophe that ends the Bronze Age across the eastern Mediterranean, and Hattusa is abandoned to the wind and the grass. The western coast fills with Greek settlers. Ephesus, Miletus, Smyrna, these cities grow into centers of philosophy, commerce, and art. It is in Miletus that Thales first attempts to explain the natural world without recourse to myth. The Persian Empire absorbs Anatolia into its satrapy system in the 6th century before the Common Era, and then Alexander of Macedon sweeps through in 334 years before the Common Era, liberating the Greek cities and opening the land to Hellenistic culture. After Alexander's death, his generals divide the world, and Anatolia passes through the hands of the Seleucids, the kingdom of Pergamon, and finally Rome. Under Roman rule, Anatolia becomes one of the wealthiest provinces of the empire. Roads of fitted stone cross the plateau. Aqueducts carry water into cities of marble and tile. Ephesus becomes a city of 250,000 people, its great library standing beside temples and colonnaded streets. Christianity spreads through these same Roman roads, carried by Paul of Tarsus, himself an Anatolian, into the cities of the coast and the interior. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire has become Christian, and when the empire divides, Anatolia becomes the heartland of the eastern half. The Byzantine Empire centered on Constantinople, the city built by Constantine on the shores of the Bosphorus. For 7 centuries, Byzantine Anatolia is a world of domed churches, golden mosaics, and Greek-speaking farmers and soldiers who call themselves Romans. The Hagia Sophia rises in Constantinople as the largest enclosed space on earth. Monasteries cling to cliffsides. The plateau sustains a dense agricultural civilization. but pressure comes from every direction. Arab armies in the 7th and 8th centuries, internal theological disputes, and finally, in 1071 years of the Common Era, a Seljuk army meets a Byzantine force at Manzikert in eastern Anatolia. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV is captured on the battlefield. The door to Anatolia swings open, and the world that has existed here for 9,000 years begins its next great transformation. Far to the east of Anatolia, beyond the Caspian Sea and the great rivers of Central Asia, a vast ocean of grass stretches toward the horizon in every direction. The steppe is not empty. It is alive with movement. The thunder of hooves, the creak of wagon wheels, the smoke of cooking fires rising from felt-covered yurts at dusk. Here, across the grasslands that run from Mongolia to the Black Sea, the Turkic peoples have lived for centuries as herders, warriors, and traders, organized into confederations that rise and collapse with the rhythm of conquest and ecological pressure. In 552 years of the Common Era, the Göktürk Khaganate emerges as the first great Turkic political formation, stretching from the borders of China to the edges of Persia. The Göktürks leave behind runic inscriptions carved into stone monuments on the Mongolian steppe, the earliest written records of a Turkic language, and they establish the template of steppe governance, a supreme Khagan commanding loyalty through military success, distributing wealth from trade and tribute, holding together a confederation of clans through prestige and force. When the Göktürk Khaganate fractures in the 8th century, successor confederations fill the space. The Uyghur Khaganate rises, controls the Silk Road corridors, and trades silk and horses with Tang dynasty China. The steppe is never static. Pressure from the east pushes peoples westward. Ecological shifts, droughts, the exhaustion of pasture land, drive migrations that reshape the political map of Eurasia across generations. Among the many Turkic groups moving through this world are the Oghuz, a confederation of tribes whose westward drift carries them toward the Islamic world of Central Asia. Contact with the Abbasid Caliphate and the merchant networks of Khorasan brings Islam into Oghuz life gradually, through traders, scholars, and Sufi missionaries who travel the same routes as caravans. Around 985 years of the Common Era, a chieftain named Seljuk and his followers formally convert to Islam. The conversion is not merely spiritual. It aligns the Seljuks with the most powerful civilizational network of the medieval world, opening doors to patronage, legitimacy, and alliance. Within 2 generations, the Seljuks transform from a tribal band into a conquering dynasty. Under Tugril, they sweep through Khorasan, capturing the great city of Nishapur in 1038. By 1055, Tugril enters Baghdad and receives the title of Sultan from the Abbasid Caliph, becoming the military protector of Sunni Islam. The Seljuk warriors ride in lamella armor, their horses bred for endurance across vast distances. Their armies combine steppe mobility with the administrative traditions of the Persian and Islamic worlds they absorb. Persian becomes the language of their court. Islamic law governs their cities. But the steppe instinct for movement and expansion never leaves them. Under Sultan Alp Arslan, the Seljuks push toward the Byzantine frontier. Raids into eastern Anatolia intensify through the 1060s. Byzantine border defenses, already weakened by internal political struggles, cannot hold the pressure. In 1071, near the town of Manzikert beside Lake Van, the 2 worlds collide. The Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV leads a large but fractious army. Alp Arslan commands a force of disciplined Seljuk cavalry. The battle is swift and decisive. Byzantine formations break under the feigned retreats and encircling archery that defined steppe warfare. Romanos is captured, an event without precedent in Byzantine history. The door does not simply open after Manzikert. It is torn from its frame. Turkic tribes pour into Anatolia not as an organized army, but as a migration. Families, herds, and warriors seeking pasture land and opportunity in a landscape suddenly undefended. Within a decade, Seljuk horsemen water their animals in rivers that once flowed through the heart of Byzantine civilization. The plateau that sustained Roman legions and Byzantine farmers is becoming something new. The transformation is irreversible. A world 9,000 years in the making is entering its next chapter, and the people who will write it have arrived from the far edge of the known world, carrying their faith, their language, and the memory of an endless sky. They call it the Sultanate of Rum, Rome in the Arabic tongue, and the name itself carries the weight of what has happened. The Seljuks who settle into Anatolia after Manzikert do not erase the world they have entered. They name themselves after it. The plateau that once sustained Byzantine civilization now becomes the foundation of something new, something that is neither purely Turkic, nor purely Islamic, nor purely the heir of what came before, but a layered civilization drawing from all three at once. The capital takes root at Konya, the ancient Iconium of the Romans, set on the broad central plateau where the land stretches flat and pale toward every horizon. Here the sultans of Rum build their court in the Persian literary tradition, surrounding themselves with poets, scholars, and architects who speak and write in the refined language of Khorasan, rather than the rougher Turkic of the steppe. The Aladdin Mosque rises on the city's central hill, its stone walls enclosing a forest of columns salvaged from older structures, Roman, Byzantine, Hellenistic, repurposed and absorbed into a new sacred geometry. The past is not demolished, it is incorporated. Across the plateau, the Sultanate builds its most enduring physical legacy, the caravanserai network. These great stone way station complexes appear at regular intervals along the major trade routes, spaced approximately a day's journey apart, so that no merchant caravan need sleep unprotected beneath the open sky. Their facades are carved with geometric interlace and muqarnas vaulting of extraordinary precision. Inside, covered halls shelter animals and goods, while separate chambers provide warmth and rest for travelers of every faith and origin. The sultans fund these structures not merely as acts of piety, but as instruments of economic policy. Trade flowing through Anatolia generates revenue, and revenue sustains the court at Konya. The reign of Sultan Kaikubad I, who rules from 1220 to 1237, represents the Sultanate at its fullest expression. Under his patronage, Konya becomes a city of genuine cultural weight. The mystic poet Jalal ad-Din Rumi arrives in Konya during this period, drawn from Khorasan by the turbulence of the Mongol advance already pressing from the east. His presence transforms the city into a center of Sufi thought and devotional music. The Sama ceremony, the turning of the dervishes, robes spreading like white wings, takes shape in the lodges of Konya as a living theology of divine love expressed through motion and sound. Persian manuscripts illuminate these ideas in lapis and gold, their pages dense with calligraphy that curves and breathes like living script. But the East does not wait. The Mongol armies of the successors of Genghis Khan sweep westward with a momentum that no regional power can absorb alone. In 1243, at the pass of Köse Dağ in the mountains of eastern Anatolia, the Seljuk army meets the Mongol force under the commander Baiju. The confrontation is brief and catastrophic. The Seljuk forces break. The Sultan flees. The army that had secured the plateau for over a century dissolves in a single afternoon. The Sultanate of Rum does not immediately vanish. It lingers for decades as a Mongol vassal, its sultans ruling in name, while Mongol governors hold the actual power. But its coherence is gone. The caravanserais stand empty or damaged. The court at Konya loses its authority. The plateau fractures into competing principalities, small Turkic frontier states, each claiming a portion of the broken inheritance. From this fragmentation, from this landscape of shattered power and contested borderlands, the next chapter of Anatolian history will slowly and violently emerge. The plateau fractures, and from its fracture something new begins to breathe. In the decades after Köse Dağ, Western Anatolia becomes a landscape of competing ambitions. The Mongol overlords hold the east with iron discipline, but the western borderlands, the frontier zones where Byzantine territory meets the broken remnants of Seljuk authority, belong to no one with certainty. Into this uncertain space move the Beyliks, small Turkic principalities, each led by a warrior chieftain, each pressing against Byzantine villages and fortified towns, each sustained by the energy of the Ghazi tradition. The holy frontier raider who fights at the edge of the Islamic world and earns both plunder and spiritual merit in the same stroke. These are not yet states in any formal sense. They are organized momentum, communities of horsemen and settlers gathered around a leader capable of winning. Near the town of Söğüt, in the low hills of northwestern Anatolia, one such community gathers around a man named Osman. The sources that describe him are few and filtered through later Ottoman memory, but the outline is clear enough. Osman is the son of Ertuğrul, leader of the Kayu tribe, a small group settled in this border zone under Seljuk patronage. When Ertuğrul dies around 1280, Osman inherits leadership of a modest frontier band. What distinguishes him from dozens of similar chieftains is not yet apparent. The land around Söğüt is modest, wooden structures, grazing grounds, the smell of horses and cook fires, the sound of a community that lives close to the edge of violence and survival. But Osman begins to raid. He strikes Byzantine frontier settlements with increasing confidence, absorbing smaller groups into his following, attracting Ghazi warriors drawn by his reputation and his success. Around 1299, the date that Ottoman tradition would later formalize as the founding moment, his principality begins to take on the character of something more than a raiding band. He issues coins, he administers justice, he forms alliances with neighboring Muslim communities and with some Byzantine frontier lords who find pragmatic cooperation more useful than resistance. The founding mythology that later Ottoman historians would elaborate, the dream of Osman in which a great tree grows from his chest and spreads its shade across the world, speaks to how the dynasty would understand its own origins, divinely sanctioned, organically expanding, rooted in this specific northwestern soil. The real expansion accelerates under pressure and opportunity simultaneously. Byzantine Anatolia is thinly defended, its resources stretched, its frontier towns increasingly isolated. Osman's forces besiege Bursa, a prosperous city at the foot of the great mountain the Turks call Uludağ, for years. Osman himself does not live to see it fall. He dies around 1326, and it is his son Orhan who receives the city's surrender that same year. Orhan makes Bursa the first true Ottoman capital. The city transforms. A mosque rises. A market takes shape. An administrative structure begins to crystallize around the new ruler, not merely a chieftain now, but a sultan in the making. Orhan reigns until 1362, and his reign is the hinge on which the Ottoman story turns from frontier raiding into genuine state-building. He organizes an early infantry force, the precursor to the Janissary Corps, paid in wages rather than plunder, loyal to the state rather than to tribal bonds alone. He extends Ottoman control along the Marmara coast, capturing Izmit in 1327 and pressing steadily toward the straits that separate Asia from Europe. The Byzantine Empire, diminished and fractured, can no longer hold its Anatolian territories against this sustained pressure. Then comes the crossing. In 1354, Ottoman forces under Orhan's son Suleiman Pasha cross the Dardanelles and seize the fortress of Gallipoli, Gelibolu, after an earthquake weakens its walls. It is the first permanent Ottoman foothold in Europe. The significance is immediate and enormous. The Balkans open before them, a landscape of competing Christian kingdoms, Orthodox communities, and trade routes connecting the Aegean to the Danube. What began near Söğüt as a modest frontier band now stands on two continents. The dream, whatever its origins, is becoming geography. From Gallipoli, the Ottoman advance does not pause. Under Murad I, who inherits the throne from Orhan in 1362, the empire moves deeper into the Balkan interior. Adrianople, the great Roman city on the Thracian plain, falls to Ottoman forces around 1369 and is renamed Edirne. It becomes the new Ottoman capital, a city of mosques and markets rising on European soil, signaling that this is no temporary incursion but a permanent civilizational presence. The Byzantine Empire, reduced now to little more than Constantinople and a few coastal fragments, watches from behind its ancient walls as the world it once commanded is remade around it. The Christian kingdoms of Europe do not accept this quietly. In 1396, a massive crusading force assembles at Nicopolis on the Danube. Knights from France, Hungary, Burgundy, and the Holy Roman Empire, confident in their armored cavalry and the righteousness of their cause. Sultan Bayezid I, who has earned the name Thunderbolt for the speed of his campaigns, meets them on the field. The battle is swift and catastrophic for the Crusaders. The flower of European chivalry is captured or killed. Bayezid's reputation reaches across the continent. The Ottoman state is no longer a frontier curiosity. It is a power that defeats the combined armies of Christian Europe. Yet within 6 years, the empire nearly ceases to exist. In 1402, Timur, the great conqueror from Samarkand, descends on Anatolia with an army that dwarfs anything the Ottomans can assemble. At the Battle of Ankara, Bayezid is defeated and captured, dying in captivity shortly after. The Ottoman state fractures into competing princedoms as Bayezid's sons fight one another for supremacy in a decade of civil war known as the Ottoman Interregnum. Timur's empire does not endure, but the damage he inflicts nearly undoes everything Osman's descendants have built. Recovery comes slowly, then with gathering force. Mehmed I reunifies the empire by 1413. His son Murad II consolidates Ottoman power across the Balkans and Anatolia, repelling another crusading effort at Varna in 1444. When Murad dies in 1451, his son Mehmed II inherits a state that is powerful, ambitious, and focused on a single objective that has obsessed Ottoman rulers for generations: Constantinople. Mehmed II is 21 years old when he begins the siege. He is methodical, multilingual, and possessed of a historical imagination that understands what the conquest of the Byzantine capital would mean. He commissions a Hungarian engineer named Orban to cast a cannon of unprecedented size, a bronze barrel capable of hurling stone balls weighing over 500 kilograms across distances that render the ancient Theodosian walls suddenly vulnerable. The cannon takes months to cast and requires dozens of oxen to move into position. When it fires, the ground trembles for miles. The siege begins in early April of 1453. For 53 days, the walls absorb bombardment, assault, and relentless pressure. The Byzantine defenders, numbering perhaps 7,000 against an Ottoman force of 60,000 or more, hold with extraordinary tenacity. The great chain stretched across the Golden Horn delays the Ottoman fleet. But Mehmed orders his ships dragged overland on greased logs, bypassing the chain entirely, and suddenly Byzantine defenders must divide their attention across a longer perimeter they cannot adequately man. On the 29th of May, 1453, the final assault breaches the walls. Emperor Constantine XI dies fighting near the gate of St. Romanos, his body never conclusively identified. By midday, Mehmed rides through the city to the Hagia Sophia, the great domed cathedral of Eastern Christendom, standing for nearly 1,000 years. He dismounts, takes a handful of earth, and pours it over his turban in an act of humility before God, then enters the building and orders it consecrated as a mosque. The mosaics are not immediately destroyed. The dome, which has caught the light of Christian liturgy for centuries, now shelters the prayers of a new faith. The fall of Constantinople sends tremors across Europe and the Islamic world alike. 1,000-year empire has ended in a single morning. The Eastern Mediterranean has a new master, and the young sultan who accomplished it will spend the remaining decades of his reign building Istanbul, as the city is now increasingly called, into one of the world's great capitals, a city of domes and minarets rising above the waters where two continents meet and the ancient world gives way to something entirely new. Mehmed II doesn't rest after Constantinople. In the years following 1453, he rebuilds the city with deliberate ambition, repopulating its emptied quarters with Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Muslims brought from across the empire, constructing the Topkapi Palace on the promontory where the Golden Horn meets the Bosphorus, and laying the foundations of an imperial capital that will govern 3 continents. He campaigns relentlessly, into Serbia, into the Peloponnese, into Trebizond, into the Crimea. By the time of his death in 1481, the Ottoman Empire stretches from the Danube to the Euphrates. His son Bayezid II rules with more caution, consolidating rather than expanding, absorbing the tens of thousands of Jewish refugees expelled from Spain in 1492 into Ottoman cities where they will flourish for generations. Then comes Selim I, called Yavuz, the Grim, who reigns only 8 years but transforms the empire's identity entirely. In 1514, he defeats the Safavid Shah Ismail at the Battle of Chaldiran, securing the eastern frontier. In 1517, he destroys the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt in a campaign of stunning speed, entering Cairo and absorbing not only Egypt, but Syria, the Hejaz, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The Ottoman Sultan is now the guardian of Islam's most sacred sites. The caliphate in symbolic form passes to the Ottoman house. The empire has become something more than a military power. It has become the center of the Sunni Muslim world. Into this inheritance steps Suleiman, who takes the throne in 1520 at the age of 25. He is educated, deliberate, and possessed of an administrative intelligence that will earn him the title Kanuni, the lawgiver, among his own people, even as Europeans call him magnificent for the spectacle of his court and the reach of his armies. Within a year of his accession, Belgrade falls. Within 2 years, Rhodes, the island fortress of the Knights Hospitaller, surrenders after a siege of 5 months. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohács on the Hungarian plain, Ottoman cavalry and artillery shatter the Hungarian army in less than 2 hours, killing King Louis II of Hungary. The road to Central Europe lies open. 3 years later, Ottoman forces stand before the walls of Vienna. The siege of 1529 does not succeed. The season is late, the supply lines are stretched, and the walls hold. But the tremor it sends through European courts is profound. No power in Christendom can ignore what has arrived at its threshold. Suleiman campaigns east as well, capturing Baghdad from the Safavids in 1534. His admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa commands the Mediterranean with Ottoman galleys, winning the Battle of Preveza in 1538 and establishing naval supremacy across the sea's eastern and central waters. The empire at its peak under Suleiman governs perhaps 20 million people across 3 continents, from the grasslands of Hungary to the deserts of Arabia, from the Black Sea coast to the shores of Algeria. Its revenues flow into Istanbul through customs houses, land taxes, and the tribute of vassal states. The Topkapi Palace expands into a city within a city, its courtyards layered in hierarchy, its kitchens feeding thousands daily, its treasury accumulating objects of extraordinary craft. Suleiman's throne, encrusted with gold and precious stones, receives ambassadors from Venice, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Persia. The French King Francis I seeks Ottoman alliance against the Habsburgs, and Suleiman obliges, a partnership that shocks European Christendom and demonstrates the empire's willingness to operate as a fully sovereign world power on its own terms. The great mosque that will bear Suleiman's name rises above Istanbul through the 1540s and 50s, designed by the imperial architect Mimar Sinan. Its dome clears the skyline with a confidence that answers Hagia Sophia across the city's hills. When the Suleimaniye Mosque is completed in 1557, it stands not merely as a place of prayer, but as a declaration of power, of permanence, of a civilization that has absorbed the ancient world and made something new from it. Suleiman dies in 1566 during his 13th military campaign, in his tent before the Hungarian fortress of Szigetvar. He does not live to see it fall, but the empire he leaves behind is the largest, wealthiest, and most powerful state in the world at that moment, a structure of such scale and complexity that its unraveling will take centuries. The empire Suleiman leaves behind is not only a military achievement, it is a civilization, layered, intricate, and self-sustaining, built from institutions, aesthetics, and systems of governance that reach into every corner of daily life across 3 continents. To understand what the Ottomans built at their peak, one must look not only at the campaigns and the conquests, but at the workshops, the courtyards, the legal codes, and the stones themselves. No figure embodies this civilizational ambition more completely than Mimar Sinan. Born around 1489 in the Anatolian town of Aurnas, Sinan entered imperial service through the Devshirme system, the structured recruitment of Christian-born boys into Ottoman state service that had been formalized under Murad I in the 14th century. These boys were taken from Balkan and Anatolian Christian families, converted to Islam, educated in palace schools, and trained for roles in the military, the bureaucracy, and the arts. Sinan rose through the Janissary Corps as a military engineer, building bridges and fortifications on campaign. He was appointed chief imperial architect under Suleiman around 1538, and what followed was one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of architecture. Over the course of his long life, he died in 1588, approaching his 100th year. Sinan designed more than 300 structures: mosques, bridges, caravanserais, schools, hospitals, and mausoleums scattered across the empire from Budapest to Damascus. His Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1557, demonstrated his mastery of scale and light. But it is the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, completed in 1575 under Sultan Selim II, that Sinan himself considered his greatest achievement. Its single dome, wider than that of the Hagia Sophia, rises above 4 slender minarets that pierce the sky with extraordinary elegance. Inside, the space opens with a clarity that feels almost impossible, light flooding through hundreds of windows, the dome appearing to float without visible support. Sinan had solved, in stone and mathematics, what centuries of builders had struggled to achieve. Alongside Sinan's architecture, the workshops of Iznik, the ancient city of Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia, were producing ceramic tiles of breathtaking quality. Iznik craftsmen refined a technique using white slip and transparent glaze over a quartz-rich body, achieving colors of extraordinary purity. A cobalt blue of almost impossible depth, a tomato red that no other tradition had mastered, and turquoise greens that seemed to carry light within them. These tiles covered the interiors of imperial mosques, palace chambers, and mausoleums across the empire. The Rustam Pasha Mosque in Istanbul, completed around 1563, is sheathed in Iznik tile work from floor to gallery, a surface of such density and brilliance that it transforms the act of entering a building into something close to immersion. The Grand Bazaar of Istanbul, established in 1461 under Mehmed II, served as the commercial nervous system of this civilization. By the 16th century, it housed thousands of shops organized by trade: jewelers, silk merchants, spice dealers, leather workers, and goldsmiths, each guild occupying its own vaulted corridor. The bazaar was not merely a marketplace. It was a regulated institution, governed by imperial decree, where prices, weights, and quality standards were enforced by inspectors. Merchants from Venice, Persia, Egypt, and the Black Sea ports moved through its covered streets, conducting transactions in a dozen languages. Governing this diversity required institutional imagination. The millet system, formalized under Mehmed II, granted recognized religious communities, Greek Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, and Jews, the right to govern their own internal affairs through their religious leaders, maintaining their own courts, schools, and charitable institutions. The system was not equality in any modern sense, but it allowed a vast multi-faith empire to function with remarkable coherence across centuries. Within Topkapi Palace, the imperial harem was equally a political institution. The mothers, wives, and concubines of the Sultan exercised real influence over succession and court appointments, a phenomenon historians call the Sultanate of Women, which reached its height in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The harem was a world of hierarchy, education, and intrigue, producing women of considerable political skill who shaped the empire's direction from within its most private spaces. The civilization Sinan built in stone, and the civilization that governed itself through law, commerce, faith, and family, were, in the end, expressions of the same extraordinary ambition. The empire does not exist only in its palaces and its campaigns. It exists in the smell of bread baking before dawn in a Constantinople market lane, in the sound of a muezzin's call drifting across the rooftops of Cairo, in the creak of a loaded cart crossing a stone bridge in the Balkans. To understand the Ottoman world at its height, from roughly 1500 to 1700, is to understand a civilization that governed 20 to 30 million people across 3 continents, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping in mosques and churches and synagogues, and yet moving through a shared political and commercial order that gave their daily lives a recognizable shape. Istanbul at dawn is a city of layered sound and motion. Before the markets open, the porters are already moving. Men who carry impossible loads on their backs through the steep lanes between the Golden Horn and the Bazaar Quarter. The Grand Bazaar, established in 1461 under Mehmed II, is by the 16th century a covered city within a city. Thousands of shops organized by trade, each guild occupying its own corridor, the air thick with leather and spice and fresh dyed cloth. Merchants from Venice, Ragusa, Persia, and Egypt move through its vaulted passages alongside Ottoman subjects of every faith. The bazaar is not merely commerce, it is the empire's nervous system, where prices, news, and political rumor travel faster than any official dispatch. Coffee arrives in Istanbul around 1555, brought from Yemen through Cairo, and within a generation the coffee house has become one of the empire's defining social institutions. Men gather in these low-ceilinged rooms to drink, play backgammon, listen to storytellers, and discuss the affairs of the day. The Ottoman authorities view them with periodic suspicion, fearing sedition in the conversation. But the coffee houses endure, proof that the empire's social life cannot be entirely controlled from above. Beyond Istanbul, the empire's diversity deepens. In Thessaloniki, the Jewish community, many of them Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain in 1492 and welcomed into Ottoman lands, runs textile workshops and trading houses, conducting business in Ladino while praying in Hebrew, and paying their taxes to Ottoman collectors in silver akçe coins. The millet system, formalized under Mehmed II, grants each recognized religious community, Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, Jews, the right to govern their own internal affairs through their own religious leaders. Marriage, inheritance, and communal disputes are handled within each community's own courts. The Ottoman state collects its taxes and maintains order. What happens inside the millet is largely the millet's own business. In the Balkan villages, Christian farming families live in timber and plaster houses, cultivating wheat and raising livestock on land that has passed through Byzantine, Bulgarian, Serbian, and now Ottoman administration. They pay the harak, the tax levied on non-Muslim subjects, and in some regions they face the devshirme, the periodic recruitment of their sons into imperial service. The relationship between these communities and Ottoman power is neither simple oppression nor simple tolerance. It is a negotiated coexistence, shaped by local circumstance, the personality of individual governors, and the practical needs of an empire that cannot afford to destroy the communities it depends upon for agricultural production and tax revenue. In Cairo, the Ottoman governor rules from the citadel above the city, but the rhythms of daily life in the Khan el-Khalili market quarter follow patterns far older than Ottoman rule. Arab merchants, Coptic Christian traders, and Sudanese pilgrims passing through on their way to Mecca move through lanes that have been commercial arteries for centuries. Islamic law, the Sharia, and Ottoman administrative law, the Kanun, coexist in the empire's courts, with judges trained in both traditions adjudicating disputes that range from property boundaries to commercial contracts. The legal system is complex, sometimes contradictory, and always negotiated, but it functions across an empire of extraordinary scale, with a consistency that holds the whole together across the long centuries of Ottoman power. The legal system holds across the long centuries, but the centuries themselves are changing. After Suleiman's death in 1566, something shifts in the empire's interior life. The shift is not sudden. It does not announce itself with a single battle or a single decree. It accumulates the way erosion accumulates, invisible in any single season, unmistakable across a generation. The sultans who follow Suleiman are not without ability, but none possesses his combination of military authority, administrative discipline, and personal command. The institution of the sultanate itself begins to change. Where earlier sultans campaigned in the field alongside their armies, later rulers increasingly govern from within the palace walls of Topkapi, surrounded by viziers and court factions whose influence grows as the sultan's direct engagement with the empire diminishes. The harem, once a managed institution of dynastic reproduction, becomes a theater of political competition. Mothers of princes, senior concubines, and powerful viziers maneuver for influence in ways that would have been impossible under Suleiman's watchful authority. Historians would later call this period the Sultanate of Women, not dismissively, but as an acknowledgement that power had migrated inward, away from the campaign tent and toward the palace corridor. The Janissary Corps, once the empire's most disciplined military force, undergoes its own transformation. Originally recruited through the devshirme system, the periodic levy of Christian boys who were converted, educated, and trained entirely in imperial service, the corps had been defined by its separation from ordinary society. Janissaries were forbidden to marry, forbidden to engage in trade, bound entirely to the Sultan's household. But across the late 16th and 17th centuries, these restrictions erode. Janissaries begin to marry. They pass their positions to their sons. They open shops in Istanbul's markets. The corps swells in number, from perhaps 12,000 under Suleiman to over 100,000 by the mid-17th century, but its military effectiveness does not grow with its size. What grows instead is its political weight. Janissary units begin to intervene in succession disputes, to demand payments from the treasury, to dethrone sultans who displease them. Between 1622 and 1648 alone, 3 sultans are deposed or killed with Janissary involvement. The force that once made the empire invincible has become one of its most dangerous internal pressures. The treasury feels the strain from multiple directions simultaneously. Silver flowing from the Americas into European economies drives inflation across the Mediterranean world, and Ottoman markets are not insulated from this pressure. The silver content of the Ottoman coin, the akçe, is debased repeatedly across the late 16th and 17th centuries as the government struggles to meet its obligations. Provincial tax farmers, granted the right to collect revenues in exchange for upfront payments to the central treasury, accumulate local power and sometimes withhold funds entirely. The careful administrative balance that had held the empire's vast territories together begins to loosen at its edges. And at its western frontier, a new test is approaching. In the summer of 1683, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha leads an Ottoman army of approximately 140,000 men toward Vienna, the Habsburg capital that had turned back Ottoman forces once before in 1529. The siege encampment spreads across the plains outside the city walls, in a vast canvas city of tents and supply lines. For 2 months, Ottoman engineers dig approach trenches and detonate mines beneath the Viennese fortifications. The city's defenders, numbering perhaps 11,000, hold with desperate discipline. Then, on September 12, 1683, a relief army commanded by Polish King Jan Sobieski descends from the Kahlenberg Heights in one of the largest cavalry charges in European history. The Ottoman lines collapse. The retreat becomes a rout. Kara Mustafa Pasha is strangled by order of the Sultan in December of that same year, his failure deemed unforgivable. The defeat at Vienna does not end the empire, but it ends an era of Ottoman military supremacy in Europe. The years that follow bring a sustained counteroffensive by a coalition of Habsburg, Polish, Venetian, and Russian forces. Hungary, held by the Ottomans since 1541, is lost. Podolia, taken from Poland only in 1672, is surrendered. In January 1699, Ottoman and Allied representatives sign the Treaty of Karlowitz, the first treaty in which the empire formally cedes territory it had long governed. The document is not merely a diplomatic instrument, it is a declaration, written in ink and witnessed by European powers, that the Ottoman Empire can be pushed back. The crossroads of the world still stands, but the ground beneath it has shifted in ways that will take generations to fully understand. The ground has shifted, and the empire knows it. In the decades following Karlowitz, a slow and painful recognition spreads through the Ottoman court, through the offices of grand viziers, through the minds of military commanders who have watched European armies grow faster, more disciplined, and more lethally equipped with each passing generation. The question that haunts the 18th century is not whether the empire must change. It is whether change can come quickly enough to matter. Sultan Selim III, who ascends the throne in 1789, the same year revolution tears through France, understands this with unusual clarity. He watches European military manuals translated into Ottoman Turkish. He commissions a new corps of infantry trained along French lines, drilled with European discipline, equipped with modern muskets. He calls this force the Nizam-e-Sedid, the New Order. It is a small experiment, but a deliberate one. Selim is attempting to build a modern army alongside the old one, hoping that demonstration will persuade where decree cannot. it does not. The Janissaries, who have long since ceased to be an effective fighting force, but remain a powerful political institution, resist. In 1807, they rise against the reforms. Selim is deposed. 2 years later, he is dead. But the lesson is not forgotten. It is absorbed, stored, and eventually acted upon by a ruler of far harder temperament. Mahmud II comes to power in 1808, and he spends nearly 2 decades preparing for what Selim could not accomplish. He rebuilds alliances, neutralizes rivals, and waits. Then, in June of 1826, he moves. The Janissary barracks in Istanbul are surrounded. Artillery opens fire. The buildings burn. Thousands of Janissaries are killed or exiled. The core that had defined Ottoman military life for nearly 5 centuries is abolished in a single violent week. Mahmud calls it the Vakayı Hayriye, the auspicious incident. The name is propaganda, but the act is real. The old army is gone. Mahmud does not stop there. He appears in public in a Western-style military uniform, a deliberate provocation against tradition, a visible signal that the empire's relationship with its own past is being renegotiated. New schools open. A state gazette begins publication. The first Ottoman census is attempted. Ministries modeled on European administrative structures replace older councils. The empire is being rebuilt from the inside, institution by institution, while its external borders continue to contract. The Gülhane Decree of 1839, issued under Mahmud's successor, Abdülmecid I, marks the formal beginning of what becomes known as the Tanzimat, the reorganization. The decree is read aloud in the Rose Garden of Topkapi Palace before assembled dignitaries, foreign ambassadors, and religious scholars. It promises something the empire has never formally guaranteed: equality before the law for all subjects, regardless of faith. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Ottoman subjects are, in principle, to be governed by the same legal codes, tried in the same courts, protected by the same rights. It is a revolutionary statement, even if its implementation remains uneven and contested for decades. What follows across the middle of the 19th century is a transformation visible in stone and steel. The Dolmabahce Palace, completed in 1856 along the European shore of the Bosphorus, replaces Topkapi as the imperial residence, its neoclassical facade and crystal chandeliers announcing an empire that now measures itself against Paris and Vienna. That same year, the first Ottoman railway line opens. Telegraph wires begin crossing Anatolia, connecting Istanbul to distant provincial capitals with a speed that would have seemed miraculous a generation earlier. European-style ministry buildings rise in Istanbul's sublime port district, staffed by a new class of Ottoman bureaucrats educated in French, fluent in diplomatic correspondence, and dressed in the frock coats and trousers that Mahmud had made fashionable by example. An Ottoman press emerges. Newspapers debate reform, tradition, and the empire's place in a rapidly changing world. A generation of intellectuals, the young Ottomans, begins arguing that the empire needs not merely administrative modernization, but genuine constitutional government, a parliament, a written guarantee of political rights. They write in cafes and in exile, in Istanbul and in Paris, in a language that is itself being modernized, stripped of its most ornate Persian and Arabic constructions, pressed toward something more direct and legible. The empire is remaking itself, but the pace of external pressure exceeds the pace of internal transformation. Territories continue to slip away. debts accumulate. By 1876, the Ottoman state is effectively bankrupt, its finances supervised by European creditors. A constitution is briefly proclaimed that year, then suspended within 2 years by Sultan Abdulhamid II, who will rule for decades as an autocrat, convinced that reform and survival are incompatible. The Tanzimat era closes not with triumph, but with a question still unanswered: whether an empire of this age and complexity can reinvent itself before the world runs out of patience with its attempts. The question that haunts the 19th century is not whether the Ottoman Empire will change. It is whether change can arrive before dissolution does. Europe watches, and Europe calculates. The great powers, Britain, France, Russia, Austria, each carry their own ambitions towards the weakening empire, and each speaks the language of concern while pursuing the logic of advantage. Russia pushes southward, seeking warm water ports and influence over Orthodox Christian populations within Ottoman borders. Britain fears Russian expansion towards the Mediterranean and India's approaches. France cultivates Catholic communities in the Levant. Austria watches the Balkans with the anxiety of a neighbor who knows that instability travels. The Ottoman Empire becomes the object of a vast geopolitical competition that its own leaders can neither control nor escape. This is what European diplomats call the Eastern Question, a polite name for the slow negotiation over who will inherit the pieces of a dying order. The first major fracture comes from Greece. By 1821, Greek revolutionary fighters, drawing on Enlightenment ideas of nationhood and ancient Hellenic identity, rise against Ottoman rule across the Peloponnese and the Aegean Islands. The fighting is brutal on both sides. Ottoman forces, including Egyptian troops under Ibrahim Pasha, suppress the revolt with devastating efficiency in certain regions. But European public opinion, inflamed by Romantic Philhellenism and the writings of poets and intellectuals, pushes Britain, France, and Russia to intervene. At the Battle of Navarino in 1827, a combined European fleet destroys the Ottoman and Egyptian naval force. By 1829, the Treaty of Adrianople ends the war, and Greek independence is formally recognized, the first successful nationalist dismemberment of Ottoman European territory. The precedent is set. Nationalist movements across the Balkans take note. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 arrives from a different direction. Russia, claiming the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the empire, presses into the Danubian principalities. Britain and France, alarmed by Russian ambitions, enter the war on the Ottoman side, an alliance of convenience that saves the empire temporarily, but extracts a price. The war is fought in the Crimean Peninsula with extraordinary suffering on all sides. Florence Nightingale tends the wounded at Scutari. The siege of Sevastopol lasts nearly a year. Russia is eventually forced to terms at the Congress of Paris in 1856, which formally guarantees Ottoman territorial integrity, while simultaneously requiring the empire to extend further legal equality to its Christian subjects. The empire survives, but survival now depends on European approval. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 strips away that illusion entirely. Russian armies cross the Danube and drive toward Istanbul with a speed that shocks the Ottoman command. The fortress of Plevna holds for months under Osman Pasha, becoming a symbol of Ottoman resistance, but it falls in December of 1877. By January of 1878, Russian forces stand at San Stefano, within sight of the Ottoman capital. The resulting treaty creates a large Bulgarian state under Russian influence, cedes territories in the Caucasus, and leaves the empire shattered. European powers, alarmed by Russian gains, convene the Congress of Berlin in 1878. The treaty that emerges reduces Bulgaria's size, but confirms the independence of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro. The empire loses the majority of its remaining European population in a single diplomatic season. Into this wreckage steps Abdülhamid II. He had briefly accepted a constitution in 1876, but suspends it within 2 years, ruling from his Yıldız Palace in Istanbul, surrounded by an elaborate network of informants and advisors. He is not simply a reactionary. He understands that the empire's Muslim core must be consolidated if anything is to survive. He cultivates pan-Islamic ideology, positioning the Ottoman Sultan as caliph and protector of Muslims worldwide, from Central Asia to West Africa. He builds railways, including the Hejaz Railway toward Mecca, as instruments of both piety and control. He modernizes the telegraph network while using it to monitor dissent. His reign is simultaneously reformist and repressive, visionary and fearful. He holds the empire together through suspicion and symbolism for over 30 years, while nationalist movements among Armenians, Arabs, Macedonians, and Albanians continue to grow beneath the surface. The crossroads is holding, but only barely, and only for now. Beneath the surface of Abdülhamid's carefully managed order, something is already moving. In the military academies of Istanbul and Thessaloniki, in the exile communities of Paris and Geneva, in the reading rooms where young Ottoman officers pass forbidden pamphlets between careful hands, a generation is forming its convictions. They call themselves the Committee of Union and Progress. The outside world will call them the Young Turks. They are not a single movement with a single vision. They are doctors and soldiers, poets and bureaucrats, bound together by one shared belief, that the empire is dying under the weight of one man's paranoia, and that only a constitutional order can save it. In July of 1908, military units in Macedonia mutiny. The movement spreads faster than the palace can contain it. Abdülhamid II, who has ruled for over 30 years through surveillance and suppression, reads the situation with the clarity of a man who has survived many crises. He restores the constitution of 1876. The streets of Istanbul erupt in celebration. Muslims and Christians embrace in the squares. Newspapers print freely for the first time in decades. The moment feels, briefly, like the beginning of something new. It is not. Within months, the contradictions surface. A counter-coup attempt in April of 1909, the so-called 31st of March incident, is crushed by committee forces marching from Thessaloniki. Abdülhamid II is deposed and sent into exile in that same month, replaced by his brother Mehmed V, a sultan with ceremonial authority and little real power. The Committee of Union and Progress does not govern openly at first. It governs through pressure, through the threat of force, through a network of officers and officials who understand that the constitutional facade is thinner than the posters celebrating it. The test comes sooner than anyone expects. In October of 1912, a coalition of Balkan states, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, launches coordinated attacks on Ottoman territory in Europe. The First Balkan War is a catastrophe of staggering speed. Ottoman armies, still reorganizing after decades of institutional decay, collapse across multiple fronts. Within weeks, the empire loses Macedonia, Thrace, and Albania. Edirne, Adrianople, the old Ottoman capital, the city of mosques and memories, falls to Bulgarian forces in March of 1913. The empire's European presence, built over 5 centuries, is reduced to a narrow strip around Istanbul. The human cost is immense and immediate. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims, Turks, Albanians, Bosnians, Pomaks, flee westward into Anatolia. They arrive in columns along roads that cannot accommodate them, carrying what they can, leaving behind the graves of generations. Anatolia absorbs them, but the trauma does not dissolve. It hardens. It becomes part of the political atmosphere that the Committee of Union and Progress breathes and exploits. A second Balkan War in the summer of 1913 briefly allows the Ottomans to recapture Edirne as the Balkan coalition fractures. But the recovery is partial, and the losses are permanent. The empire has shed the last of its European heartland. What remains is Anatolia, the Arab provinces, and the memory of what once stretched from Budapest to Baghdad. Into this atmosphere of humiliation and urgency, 3 men consolidate their grip on the empire's direction: Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, the triumvirate that will make the final decisions. Enver in particular is drawn toward Germany, whose military advisors are already embedded in Ottoman institutions, whose officers are training Ottoman soldiers, whose industrial power seems to offer a model and an alliance worth pursuing. When the First World War begins in the summer of 1914, the Committee of Union and Progress watches and calculates. In November of 1914, the empire enters the war on the side of Germany and the Central Powers. The decision is made by a small group of men, in secret, without full cabinet approval. It is presented to the empire and the world as necessity. It is, in truth, a gamble, the last and largest gamble of a state that has been gambling with its survival for over a century. The crossroads, which has held so many for so long, is about to be consumed by the fire it chose to enter. The fire, once entered, does not burn evenly. It consumes according to its own logic, and the Ottoman Empire, in the years between 1914 and 1918, discovers what that logic demands. The first great test comes at Gallipoli. In the spring of 1915, a combined British and French naval force attempts to force the Dardanelles Strait, seeking to open a sea route to Russia and knock the Ottomans from the war. When the naval assault fails in March, Allied ground forces land on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April, at Cape Helles in the south, and at what becomes known as Anzac Cove along the western cliffs. The terrain is brutal. Steep ravines, chalky ridge lines, and narrow beaches offering no shelter from the heights above. Ottoman defenders hold the high ground, and among their commanders is a colonel named Mustafa Kemal, who understands instinctively that the ridgeline at Çanakkale must not fall. He orders his men to hold positions that seem impossible to hold. They hold them. The Allied campaign, which was meant to last weeks, grinds on for 9 months before evacuation begins in December of 1915 and concludes in January of 1916. For the Ottoman state, Gallipoli is a rare and desperately needed victory. For Mustafa Kemal, it is the beginning of a legend. But while the cliffs of Gallipoli are being contested, something far darker is unfolding across the Anatolian interior. In the spring of 1915, the Committee of Union and Progress orders the deportation of the Armenian population from eastern Anatolia. The official justification is military security. Armenians are accused of potential collaboration with advancing Russian forces. What follows is not a security measure. It is systematic destruction. Columns of Armenian men, women, and children are marched into the Syrian desert. Men are separated and killed. Deportation routes become corridors of death, through mountain passes, across the Euphrates, into the burning lowlands beyond. Massacres are carried out by irregular forces and organized killing units. Communities that had existed in Anatolia for thousands of years are erased within months. Estimates of the dead range from 600,000 to 1.5 million. The word that will eventually be applied to what happened, genocide, does not yet exist in 1915. The reality it describes does. In 1916, the Arab revolt begins. Sharif Hussein of Mecca, encouraged and supplied by Britain, raises the banner of Arab independence against Ottoman rule. Arab cavalry strikes at Ottoman supply lines across the Hejaz and later into Syria and Palestine. The campaigns in Mesopotamia bring further disaster. British forces surrender at Kut in April of 1916 in one of the largest capitulations in British military history, though they recover and take Baghdad in 1917. By 1918, Ottoman armies are collapsing across every front. British and Arab forces under General Edmund Allenby advance through Palestine, entering Jerusalem in December of 1917 and Damascus in October of 1918. The Caucasus Front disintegrates, supply lines fail, soldiers desert in enormous numbers. The Armistice of Mudros is signed on the 30th of October, 1918, aboard a British warship in the Aegean harbour of that island. It ends Ottoman participation in the war on terms that leave the empire defenceless. Allied warships sail through the Dardanelles and anchor off Istanbul in November of 1918, the city that Mehmed II had made the heart of an empire now watched over by foreign guns. The Committee of Union and Progress leadership flees into exile. The empire that entered the war seeking to reclaim lost territories and secure its survival has instead accelerated its own destruction. What remains is a hollowed state, an occupied capital, and a people who do not yet know whether anything will survive the wreckage of the gamble that was made in their name. The wreckage is visible from every direction. Allied warships ride at anchor in the waters of the Bosphorus. British officers move through the streets of Istanbul. The Ottoman government, what remains of it, functions under foreign supervision in a capital that no longer controls its own fate. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August of 1920, makes the situation explicit. Anatolia is to be divided. Greece receives the Aegean coast and the city of Smyrna. Armenia is granted a state in the east. France and Italy claim zones of influence in the south. A Kurdish autonomous region is proposed for the southeast. What is left for the Turks is a diminished rump in the interior, a fragment of the land their ancestors had held for centuries. One man refuses to accept this as the final word. Mustafa Kemal arrives at the Black Sea port of Samsun on the 19th of May, 1919, nominally dispatched by the Istanbul government to oversee the demobilization of remaining Ottoman forces in the Anatolian interior. What he does instead is the opposite. Moving inland across the high plateau, he begins organizing. Congresses are called, at Erzurum in July, at Sivas in September, where nationalist delegates from across Anatolia gather to declare that the Turkish people will not submit to partition. The movement that forms around these meetings is not yet an army. It is a declaration of intent, written in the language of survival. Ankara becomes the center. A modest Anatolian town, far from the occupied capital, it offers distance from Allied surveillance and proximity to the Anatolian heartland. The Grand National Assembly opens there in April of 1920, and Kemal is elected its president. The assembly governs in parallel with the Istanbul Sultanate, two governments, two visions of what Turkey might become, operating simultaneously on the same soil. The military campaign that follows is brutal and prolonged. Greek forces, backed by Allied support and emboldened by the terms of Sèvres, push deep into western Anatolia. The battles of Inonu in 1921 halt the Greek advance. The Battle of Sakarya, fought across 3 weeks in August and September of 1921 along a river west of Ankara, becomes the turning point. Kemal commands in the field. The Greek offensive is broken. The nationalist forces, reorganized, resupplied, and driven by the knowledge that there is no alternative, begin to push westward. By September of 1922, the Greek army is in full retreat toward the Aegean coast. Smyrna, ancient, cosmopolitan, the great port city of western Anatolia, burns. The fire that breaks out in the city in September of 1922 destroys the Greek and Armenian quarters and drives tens of thousands of civilians to the waterfront. The images of the burning city and the crowds trapped between the flames and the sea become one of the defining catastrophes of the era. The human cost is immense. The strategic meaning is unambiguous. The Greek military presence in Anatolia is finished. What follows is negotiation. The conference at Lausanne, in Switzerland, opens in November of 1922 and concludes with the Treaty of Lausanne on the 24th of July, 1923. The treaty is a reversal of Sèvres in almost every particular. The borders of the new Turkish state are recognized across Anatolia and eastern Thrace. The capitulations that had given European powers legal privileges on Ottoman soil for centuries are abolished, and a population exchange is formalized, one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. Approximately 1,400,000 Greek Orthodox Christians leave Anatolia for Greece. Approximately 500,000 Muslims leave Greece for Turkey. Communities rooted in their lands for generations are uprooted by the logic of ethnic separation. The exchange is presented as a solution. It is also a wound. The crossroads has been redrawn. What emerges from Lausanne is not an empire. It is a nation, bounded, defined, and determined to survive on its own terms. The man who made it possible stands in Ankara, in a building that was never meant to house the capital of anything, preparing to transform not only the borders of a state, but the identity of a people. Ankara in the autumn of 1923 is not yet a capital in any grand sense. Its streets are unpaved in places. Its government buildings are modest, functional, provisional. The dust of the Anatolian plateau settles on everything. And yet it is here, in this inland city chosen precisely because it is not Istanbul, not the old imperial seat, not the place of sultans and caliphs and foreign warships, that the new order announces itself. On the 29th of October, 1923, the Grand National Assembly votes to declare Turkey a republic. Mustafa Kemal becomes its first president. The moment is deliberate in every detail. The choice of Ankara over Istanbul is itself a statement, a rejection of the Ottoman past, a declaration that what is being built here belongs to a different logic entirely. The Sultanate had already been abolished in November of 1922, severing the political dimension of Ottoman rule. In March of 1924, the Caliphate follows, the religious office that had connected the Ottoman dynasty to the spiritual leadership of the Sunni Muslim world for 4 centuries. It is abolished by the same assembly that proclaimed the Republic. The last Caliph, Abdulmajid II, is escorted to a train and sent into exile. With him goes a claim to universal Islamic authority that had survived empires, wars, and centuries of transformation. It does not survive Kemal. What follows is a revolution conducted from above, at extraordinary speed, with deliberate comprehensiveness. The religious courts are closed. The Swiss civil code is adopted in their place, introducing a unified secular legal system governing marriage, inheritance, and family life. The dervish lodges and Sufi brotherhoods, the tekkes and zawiyas that had shaped Ottoman spiritual life for centuries, are banned in 1925. The fez, that symbol of Ottoman modernity from an earlier era, is outlawed and replaced by the brimmed hat. The change is not merely sartorial, it is a signal about which direction the new republic faces. In 1928, the Arabic script, in which Turkish had been written for centuries, is replaced by a modified Latin alphabet. Kemal himself travels through the country with a blackboard, demonstrating the new letters. Schools are reorganized overnight. Newspapers shift their typefaces. An entire civilization's written memory becomes, for a generation, suddenly inaccessible without deliberate study. The reform is radical and irreversible. It severs the ordinary reader from Ottoman texts as cleanly as a blade. The renaming extends further. In 1934, a surname law requires all citizens to adopt family names in the Western manner. Mustafa Kemal receives from the assembly the name Atatürk, Father of the Turks. Cities and towns across Anatolia are renamed. Their Greek, Armenian, and Arabic designations replaced with Turkish ones. The landscape itself is being rewritten. That same year, 1934, Turkish women receive the right to vote and stand for election in national elections, earlier than women in France, earlier than in Italy, earlier than in many states that considered themselves the standard bearers of modern democracy. 18 women enter the Grand National Assembly in the elections that follow. Ataturk does not live to see where his republic will travel. On the 10th of November, 1938, at 9:09 in the morning, he dies at Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul. The Ottoman palace he had made a secondary residence, its Baroque European grandeur a strange setting for the man who had dismantled the world that built it. He is 57 years old. Across Turkey, clocks are stopped at the moment of his death. The nation he leaves behind is transformed in law, in alphabet, in dress, in institution. Whether it is transformed in its deepest self remains the question his successors will spend decades trying to answer. The nation Ataturk leaves behind is not a finished thing. It is a project, radical, contested, and still warm from the forge. The man who shaped it is gone, but the institutions he built remain, and so does the army he trusted above all else to guard what he had made. İsmet İnönü, Ataturk's closest military companion and longtime prime minister, assumes the presidency. The world around Turkey is already moving toward catastrophe. The Second World War erupts within a year of Ataturk's death, and İnönü navigates it with extraordinary care, signing a treaty of friendship with Britain and France in 1939, then maintaining studied neutrality as German armies sweep across Europe, North Africa, and deep into the Soviet Union. Turkey does not enter the war. It is a decision born of exhaustion as much as calculation. A nation that lost a generation between 1911 and 1923 has no appetite for another furnace. When the war ends in 1945, the world has reorganized itself into two rival blocs, and Turkey finds itself standing at their precise boundary. The Soviet Union presses for territorial concessions in eastern Anatolia and joint control over the Bosphorus Straits. The pressure is unmistakable. Turkey turns toward Washington. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 names Turkey and Greece explicitly as nations requiring American support against Soviet expansion. Military aid flows. The alignment is set. In 1952, Turkey joins the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Great Western Military Alliance, becoming its only Muslim-majority member and its southeastern anchor. Turkish soldiers had already demonstrated their commitment on the Korean peninsula, where a brigade of 4,500 men fought alongside United Nations forces between 1950 and 1953, suffering heavy casualties at battles, including the defense of Kunuri. The sacrifice is noted in Washington. The partnership deepens, but the Cold War alignment arrives alongside something equally significant: the opening of Turkish democracy. In 1950, free multi-party elections produce a stunning result. The Democrat Party, led by Adnan Menderes, defeats İnönü's Republican People's Party in a landslide. For the first time since the Republic's founding, power transfers peacefully between parties. Crowds celebrate in the streets of Istanbul and Ankara. The single-party era of Kemalist governance has ended. Menderes governs through the 1950s with a different instinct than his predecessors. He relaxes restrictions on religious expression, allows the call to prayer to return to Arabic, and pursues rapid economic development, roads, factories, agricultural mechanization. The rural population, long suspicious of Ankara's secular modernizers, responds with loyalty. But the economy overheats, inflation rises, press freedoms narrow. By 1960, Menderes is governing with increasing authoritarianism, and the military is watching. On the 27th of May, 1960, Turkish armed forces seize power in the country's first military coup. Menderes is arrested, tried before a military tribunal on the island of Yasiada, and found guilty of violating the constitution. On the 17th of September, 1961, he is hanged. 2 other ministers are executed alongside him. The soldiers return power to civilians within 2 years, but the message is permanent. The military considers itself the guardian of Atatürk's secular republic, with the authority to intervene when it judges that republic endangered. The pattern repeats. Another coup follows in 1971, a memorandum rather than tanks, but a forced change of government nonetheless. Through the 1970s, Turkey fractures along ideological lines. Left-wing and right-wing factions fight in university corridors and city streets. Political assassinations become routine. Governments rise and collapse in rapid succession. The Cyprus crisis adds another dimension. In 1974, after a Greek junta-backed coup attempts to unite Cyprus with Greece, Turkish forces land on the island's northern coast. The intervention divides Cyprus along lines that remain unresolved decades later, and strains Turkey's relationships with both Greece and the United States. By 1980, the violence has claimed thousands of lives. On the 12th of September, General Kenan Evren leads the armed forces in a third coup. State television carries the announcement in the early morning hours. Political parties are dissolved. Thousands are detained. A new constitution, drafted under military supervision, is approved by referendum in 1982. It is designed to produce stability, and it does, at a price measured in liberties compressed and voices silenced. The soldiers once again have decided that democracy must be saved from itself. The new constitution of 1982 does not simply reorganize the machinery of government. It encodes a particular vision of Turkey, orderly, secular, controlled, and embeds within it a quiet paradox. The generals who designed it, determined to crush the Marxist left that had destabilized the previous decade, make a calculated decision. Religion, managed carefully, can serve as a counterweight. The state begins to expand religious education. The number of Imam Hatip schools, institutions training prayer leaders and preachers, grows steadily through the 1980s. A generation of young Turks receives an education shaped as much by faith as by Atatürk's portrait on the classroom wall. The man who most fully understands how to move within this new landscape is Necmettin Erbakan. A mechanical engineer by training and a politician of extraordinary persistence, Erbakan has been building an Islamist political movement since the 1970s through successive parties dissolved by courts or coups. By the mid-1990s, his welfare party has become the largest single party in the Turkish parliament. In the municipal elections of 1994, the welfare party wins the mayoralties of both Istanbul and Ankara. The young mayor of Istanbul, a former footballer from a working-class neighborhood on the city's Asian shore, is named Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He repairs roads, solves the city's chronic water shortages, and governs with a competence that surprises his critics. Erbakan becomes prime minister in 1996, leading a coalition government. The secular establishment watches with mounting alarm. In February of 1997, the military's National Security Council presents the government with a memorandum, a long list of demands concerning the rollback of religious influence in public life. No tanks appear in the streets, no shots are fired, but the pressure is unmistakable. Erbakan resigns in June of 1997. The episode enters the political vocabulary as the postmodern coup. The Constitutional Court bans the Welfare Party the following year. Erdogan, meanwhile, is imprisoned in 1999 for reciting a poem deemed to incite religious hatred. He serves 4 months. When he emerges, something has clarified in his political thinking. Together with Abdullah Gül and a circle of younger pragmatists, he breaks from Erbakan's movement and founds the Justice and Development Party, in Turkish Adalet ve Kalkınma Partisi, in August of 2001. The party presents itself not as an Islamist movement, but as a conservative democratic one, explicitly committed to European Union membership and market economics. The elections of November 2002 arrive in the aftermath of a devastating economic crisis that has collapsed the Turkish lira and shattered public confidence in the existing parties. The Justice and Development Party wins 34% of the vote, enough under Turkey's electoral system to claim nearly 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. The old parties of the secular centre are wiped from parliament entirely. A political earthquake has occurred. What follows is a decade of transformation. Turkey's economy, stabilized through International Monetary Fund agreements and disciplined fiscal policy, begins to grow at rates that astonish outside observers. Between 2002 and 2010, the country's gross domestic product nearly triples. Highways are built, hospitals are modernized, Istanbul's skyline rises with cranes. A new middle class, pious and prosperous, emerges from Anatolian cities that the secular establishment had long regarded as provincial backwaters. In 2005, the European Union formally opens accession negotiations with Turkey, a milestone that reflects both the country's democratic progress and the optimism of the era. Erdogan, who becomes prime minister in 2003 after a legal barrier to his candidacy is removed, presents himself to Brussels as a reformer. Civil liberties expand. The military's political role is gradually constrained through legislative changes. Generals who once considered themselves the ultimate guardians of the Republic find their institutional authority quietly diminished. Yet the tension does not dissolve. It deepens beneath the surface. The secular Kemalist establishment, in the courts, the universities, the press, and the officer corps, watches the steady accumulation of power by a movement it does not trust. The headscarf, banned in public institutions since the early Republic, becomes a recurring flashpoint. Each accommodation, each reform, each mosque rising beside a government ministry reads differently depending on where one stands in Turkish society. The crossroads, as always, runs through the center of the nation itself. The tension that has been building beneath the surface of Turkish society for decades does not remain beneath the surface forever. In the spring of 2013, a modest plan to redevelop Gezi Park, a small green space at the edge of Taksim Square in the heart of Istanbul, ignites something far larger than urban planning. What begins as a sit-in by environmentalists protecting trees becomes, within days, a nationwide eruption. Tear gas drifts through the streets of Istanbul. Water cannons sweep protesters from bridges. In cities from Ankara to Izmir, from Eskişehir to Adana, crowds gather carrying banners that speak not only of a park, but of a political atmosphere grown suffocating. The protests draw students, secularists, Kurds, feminists, and football supporters into an unlikely coalition, united by a shared sense that the space for dissent is narrowing. The government's response is firm and unyielding. The park is cleared. The movement disperses. But the fracture it reveals does not close. 3 years later, on the night of the 15th of July, 2016, Turkey experiences something it has not seen since 1980. Soldiers move onto the Bosphorus Bridge. Fighter jets streak low over Ankara. Tanks roll through the streets of the capital. A faction within the military attempts to seize control of the state. For several hours, the outcome is genuinely uncertain. Then, through mobile phone broadcasts and mosque loudspeakers calling citizens into the streets, the coup collapses. By morning, the plotters are in custody. Over 250 people are dead. The government attributes the attempt to the Gülenist movement, followers of the cleric Fethullah Gülen, living in self-imposed exile in the United States, an organization it had once tolerated, and now designates a terrorist network. What follows is the largest purge in the history of the Republic. Within weeks, more than 150,000 soldiers, judges, academics, teachers, police officers, and journalists are detained, suspended, or dismissed. Dozens of media outlets are shuttered. The scale reshapes every institution of the state. In April of 2017, a constitutional referendum narrows passes, transforming Turkey from a parliamentary system into a presidential one. Executive power concentrates in a single office, the office Erdogan already holds. Beyond its borders, Turkey is simultaneously fighting multiple conflicts. In northern Syria, Turkish military operations target both Kurdish forces aligned with the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party and remnants of the Islamic State. In Libya, Turkish forces support the internationally recognized government against rival factions. The relationship with Russia grows complex, cooperative in some corridors, adversarial in others. The purchase of Russian air defense systems in 2019 strains Turkey's standing within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization without severing it entirely. Inside the country, more than 3.5 million Syrian refugees have settled, the largest refugee population in the world hosted by a single nation. Tent cities give way to urban neighborhoods. The strain on housing, wages, and social cohesion is real and politically charged. Economic crises in 2018 and again between 2021 and 2023 drive the Turkish lira to historic lows. Inflation reaches levels not seen in 2 decades. Ordinary households absorb the pressure in ways that statistics only partially capture. Then, on the 6th of February, 2023, 2 catastrophic earthquakes strike southeastern Turkey and northern Syria within hours of each other. The death toll in Turkey alone surpasses 50,000. Entire cities, Kahramanmaraş, Hatay, Gaziantep, are reduced to rubble. The scale of destruction is medieval in its totality. The state's response draws both admiration and fierce criticism. The earthquake does not distinguish between the secular and the devout, between the Kemalist and the conservative, between the citizen and the refugee. It falls on everyone equally, as the land beneath this ancient crossroads has always eventually reminded those who live upon it that the ground itself is not permanent. The camera rises slowly above Istanbul at dawn. Below, the Bosphorus catches the first light of morning, a silver thread stitching 2 continents together, as it has done for 10,000 years. The Hagia Sophia stands on its promontory, its great dome holding the accumulated weight of Byzantine Christianity, Ottoman Islam, secular nationalism, and reconverted faith within a single structure of stone and half-light. The Blue Mosque's 6 minarets pierce the pale sky nearby. Across the water, the Asian shore begins its own day. This is not merely a city. It is an argument about what civilization means, still unresolved, still alive. The full arc of this story stretches further than any single empire can contain. It begins in the mud-brick rooms of Çatalhöyük, where people organized their world without kings or written law. It passes through Hittite chariot armies, Greek philosophical schools along the Aegean coast, Roman roads cutting across the Anatolian plateau, and Byzantine mosaics glowing in candle-lit churches. Then come the Turkic horsemen from the Central Asian steppes, carrying Islam westward, transforming the land without erasing what came before. The Seljuks build their caravanserais. The Ottomans build their empire. Suleiman's armies stand before Vienna. Sinan's domes rise over Istanbul, Edirne, and 100 lesser cities. For 6 centuries, this empire governs more of the known world than almost any power before it. What the Ottoman Empire left behind is not simply ruins. In Sarajevo, mosques and bazaars built under Ottoman patronage still stand along the Miljacka River. In Cairo, Ottoman-era architecture layers itself over Mamluk foundations in the Khan el-Khalili quarter. In Tripoli and Algiers, in Jerusalem and Baghdad, the Ottoman urban fabric persists in street patterns, legal traditions, and administrative memory. The Balkans carry Ottoman influence in their cuisine, their music, their vocabulary, and their unresolved ethnic geographies, borders drawn and redrawn through wars that Ottoman collapse made possible and perhaps inevitable. The Kurdish question remains the most painful unresolved inheritance of the empire's dissolution. Approximately 30 million Kurds live within Turkey's borders, the largest stateless ethnic group in the world. The conflict between the Turkish state and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which began its armed insurgency in 1984, has claimed over 40,000 lives across 4 decades. Ceasefires have come and collapsed. Political parties representing Kurdish interests have been banned and reformed under new names. The question of cultural recognition, political representation, and territorial autonomy remains open, a wound that neither military force nor negotiation has yet healed. Turkey's identity remains genuinely contested. The Hagia Sophia's reconversion to a mosque in 2020 reflects a particular vision of what Turkey is and where it belongs. Yet the secular republic Atatürk built in 1923 has not disappeared. Its institutions, its educated classes, its urban professional culture, and its constitutional memory persist alongside the religious conservatism that has reshaped public life since 2002. These are not simply political disagreements. They are competing answers to a question the Republic has never fully settled. What does it mean to be Turkish in a land that was never only Turkish, never only Muslim, never only one thing? 85 million people now live within Turkey's borders. The economy, despite severe turbulence, remains among the largest in the region. The military is among the most capable in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Turkish drones, Turkish construction companies, and Turkish cultural exports reach across the former Ottoman world and beyond. The country that emerged from the ruins of 1918 has become, by any measure, a significant power, not a great empire, but something more durable, a nation that survived its own catastrophic transformation and continues to negotiate its place in a world it once dominated. The crossroads does not resolve. That is perhaps its deepest truth. Anatolia has never belonged to only one people, one faith, or one civilization. It has always been a place where worlds meet, collide, absorb, and continue. The ground beneath Istanbul holds layer upon layer of human habitation, stretching back beyond recorded memory. The Bosphorus has carried the ships of every empire that ever reached for both Europe and Asia simultaneously. That condition, of being between, of being both, of being neither entirely one thing nor another, is not a problem to be solved. It is the permanent condition of this place and this people. The story of Turkey is not finished. It is, in the truest sense, still being written. In the mosques and the courtrooms, in the mountains of the southeast and the boulevards of Istanbul, in the refugee camps and the parliament buildings, in the ancient stones and the contested present. The crossroads endures. Thank you for traveling through this extraordinary history. If this series has deepened your understanding of Turkey and the world it shaped, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new journey through the past.